The red wine splashed across Grace's white maternity dress like blood, dripping from her hair, her face, her swollen belly. The baby shower fell silent. 30 guests watched in horror as Marcus stood over his pregnant ex-wife, empty bottle in hand, his face twisted with rage and something darker, pure hatred. "You think you've won?" he hissed. "You think you can replace me?" That moment, that unforgivable act, was the culmination of 3 years of lies. But it began much differently. In a church in Lagos where Grace Okonkwo became Grace Adenuga, believing she was marrying her best friend. Marcus Adenuga was charming in the beginning. He worked in finance, drove a sleek car, and knew exactly what to say to Grace's parents. Her mother loved his ambition. Her father appreciated his traditional respect. Grace loved his laugh, the way he called her my queen. The promises he made under the stars about building a life together. The warning signs appeared within months. Marcus came home late, smelling of perfume that wasn't Grace's. When she asked, he exploded, accusing her of distrust, of trying to control him like his mother had. Grace apologized. She was taught that good wives kept peace in their homes, that patience and prayer could heal any marriage. "You're too sensitive," Marcus would say, his voice cold. "This is why no man can deal with you." The emotional cruelty became routine. He criticized everything, her cooking, her appearance, her job as a primary school teacher. When Grace's best friend Amara visited, Marcus was charming again, laughing and joking. The moment Amara left, his face went dark. "Stop telling people our business," he warned. "What happens in this house stays here." Grace stopped confiding in Amara. She stopped calling her mother. She became smaller, quieter, desperate to please a man who seemed to despise her more each day. When she suggested counseling, Marcus laughed bitterly. "Counseling? So you can tell strangers I'm a bad husband? You want to shame me." The worst betrayal came on their second anniversary. Grace planned a special dinner, wore his favorite dress, lit candles throughout their apartment. Marcus didn't come home. At midnight, Grace called his phone repeatedly. No answer. At 2 in the morning, she called his younger brother Kenneth. "Have you seen Marcus?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Kenneth's silence lasted too long. "Grace, I think you should talk to Marcus." "Kenneth, please. Is he okay?" "He's fine. He's at Vivian's place." Vivian, Marcus's colleague. The woman he'd mentioned casually dozens of times, always dismissively, always with that practiced tone that Grace now recognized as deception. The ground shifted beneath Grace's feet. She sat on their bed, still wearing the anniversary dress, and understood that her marriage was already over. She'd just been the last to know. When Marcus came home the next morning, he didn't apologize. He was angry that Grace had called his brother, angry that she'd invaded his privacy, angry that she dared to question him. "Maybe if you were more like Vivian, I wouldn't need to go elsewhere," he said, each word designed to wound. "She respects herself. She takes care of herself. Look at you." Grace looked at him, really looked at him, and saw a stranger. This wasn't the man she'd married. Or perhaps this was exactly who he'd always been. And she'd been too young, too trusting, too desperate for her parents' approval to see it. "I want a divorce," Grace said quietly. Marcus laughed. "Good luck with that. Your parents will disown you. Everyone will know you couldn't keep your husband happy. You'll be the divorced woman nobody wants." He was wrong about that, but in that moment Grace believed him. She believed she was the failure, the inadequate wife, the woman who couldn't make her marriage work. That belief nearly destroyed her before she found the strength to save herself. Grace didn't leave immediately. In her community, divorce was scandal, especially for a woman. Her mother called twice a week, asking about grandchildren, about when Grace would settle down properly and start a family. How could Grace explain that her marriage was a graveyard, that the man her parents admired was slowly killing her spirit? Marcus grew bolder. He stopped hiding his affair with Vivian. He'd take calls from her at the dinner table, laughing intimately while Grace sat across from him, invisible. When Grace's father visited, Marcus was transformed again. The dutiful son-in-law, the hard-working husband, the man with a bright future. "You've raised a good woman, sir," Marcus told Grace's father. "She's making our house a home." Grace watched this performance with dead eyes. She'd stopped crying months ago. There were no tears left for a man who discarded her so completely. The breaking point came on a Sunday. Grace's cousin was getting married, a massive celebration that her entire family would attend. Grace had bought a new dress, prepared herself to endure the inevitable questions about when she and Marcus would have children. Marcus promised to be ready by noon. At 2 in the afternoon, with Grace's family calling frantically, Marcus was still in bed, reeking of alcohol from the night before. He'd been out with Vivian again. He'd promised his wife he'd go to her cousin's wedding, and he'd broken that promise as casually as he broke all his promises to her. "Marcus, please," Grace begged. "My whole family is waiting. They'll ask questions." He looked at her with pure contempt. "Tell them the truth, Grace. Tell them you're so boring, so needy, that your husband would rather be anywhere else than with you." Something inside Grace shattered completely. Not her heart, that had broken long ago. Something deeper. Her fear. Her people-pleasing. Her desperate need to maintain the illusion of a happy marriage. She looked at Marcus, drunk and cruel in their bed, and felt nothing but ice-cold clarity. "I'm leaving you," she said. "Today. Right now." Marcus sat up, suddenly alert. "You're not going anywhere." "Yes, I am. I'm going to the wedding. When I come back, I'm packing my things. Tomorrow I'm calling a lawyer." She'd expected rage. Instead, Marcus smiled, a horrible, knowing smile. "Do it. Leave. But I'll make sure everyone knows what kind of wife you were. I'll tell them everything. Your parents, your church, everyone. They'll know you failed." "Then let them know," Grace said and walked out. At the wedding, she told Amara everything. Her best friend held her while she cried 3 years' worth of tears in the venue's bathroom. Amara's husband, Emmanuel, a human rights lawyer, gave Grace his card. "When you're ready," he said gently, "call me. Nobody should endure what you've described." Grace filed for divorce the following week. Marcus's family descended on her parents' house, where she'd fled. His mother wailed about homewreckers, about modern women who didn't know how to keep their husbands. Marcus himself played the victim masterfully, the good man destroyed by an ungrateful wife who'd abandoned him without cause. But Emmanuel was thorough. He gathered evidence. Marcus's affair with Vivian, documented through text messages Grace had photographed months ago. Financial records showing Marcus had drained their joint savings account. Testimony from neighbors who'd heard his verbal abuse through apartment walls. The divorce was granted in 6 months. Marcus was ordered to pay a small settlement. He paid nothing. Instead, he married Vivian in a lavish ceremony, posting photos on social media with captions about finally finding real love and starting fresh with a real woman. Each post was designed to hurt Grace, to tell their mutual friends and family that he'd upgraded, that Grace was the mistake he'd corrected. Grace deleted her social media. She moved to a smaller apartment in a different neighborhood. She focused on her teaching, on rebuilding herself piece by piece. Her parents eventually softened, ashamed that they'd pressured her to stay in a marriage that had nearly destroyed her. Her father apologized, tears in his eyes, for not seeing what his daughter had endured. 6 months after the divorce, Grace went to a church program organized by her cousin. She almost didn't attend, tired of pitying looks and whispered conversations. But Amara insisted, and Grace went, wearing a simple dress and no expectations of anything but an evening of worship and early sleep afterward. That's where she met Daniel Okafor, a captain in the Nigerian army, home on leave from his posting. He had kind eyes and a quiet strength that drew her immediately. Daniel didn't approach Grace at the church program. He simply smiled at her across the room, a genuine smile that made her feel seen rather than examined. They met properly a week later at a mutual friend's birthday party, and their first conversation lasted 3 hours. "I'm divorced," Grace told him on their third date, needing him to know before she got too attached. "My marriage ended badly." Daniel took her hand gently. "I'm sorry you went through that. But your past doesn't define your future. If you'll let me, I'd like to be part of that future." Grace cried that night. Not from sadness but from the shocking realization that good men existed, that kindness wasn't manipulation, that love didn't have to hurt. Daniel was patient. He never pressured her, never made her feel inadequate, never compared her to anyone. He simply loved her steadily and completely. For months into their relationship, Daniel proposed. Grace said yes without hesitation. They married in a small, beautiful ceremony surrounded by people who genuinely loved them. Marcus sent a cruel message the day of her wedding. Hope he knows what damaged goods he's getting. Grace blocked his number. She was done letting Marcus poison her happiness. Her pregnancy happened quickly, a blessing that filled Grace with joy and terror. She was 32 years old, building a life with a man who treated her with respect, carrying a child she already loved fiercely. Daniel was thrilled, already planning nurseries and reading parenting books during his deployment leaves. But Marcus found out. Someone from their old neighborhood, someone who knew both of them, mentioned it casually in a mutual WhatsApp group. Within days, Marcus knew that Grace was pregnant, happy, and married to a military officer. The information festered in him like poison. He'd expected Grace to fail after their divorce. He'd expected her to come crawling back, desperate and broken, admitting he'd been right about her worthlessness. Instead, she'd found love, stability, and was starting a family. Everything he denied her. Everything he told her she didn't deserve. Marcus's own marriage to Vivian was crumbling. She'd discovered she wasn't the only affair, that Marcus's character hadn't changed with his wife. Vivian was filing for her own divorce, leaving Marcus alone with the reality of who he was. But instead of reflecting on his choices, Marcus blamed Grace. She'd ruined his reputation by exposing him. She'd poisoned people against him with her divorce. She'd moved on too quickly, proving she'd never really loved him. His resentment grew into obsession. He checked Grace's sparse social media through fake accounts. He drove past her apartment. He asked mutual acquaintances about her, always casually, always fishing for information. When he learned about the baby shower, planned for a Saturday afternoon at Amara's home, Marcus made his decision. He would remind Grace that she couldn't escape him. He would humiliate her in front of everyone she loved, show her new husband and her new friends what kind of woman she really was. He rehearsed what he'd say, the accusations he'd make, the lies he'd tell to justify his presence. He bought a bottle of expensive red wine, not as a gift but as a weapon. The morning of the baby shower, Marcus woke with his mind made up. His mother called, asking him to reconsider the path his life had taken, to seek counseling, to address his anger before it destroyed him completely. He hung up on her. He dressed carefully, a nice shirt, cologne, the appearance of a man who'd moved on successfully. But his hands shook as he drove toward Amara's house, toward Grace, toward an act that would define him forever. Grace had no warning. She sat in Amara's beautiful garden, surrounded by pink and blue balloons, her students' handmade cards, her friends and family who'd watched her rise from her divorce. She wore white, a maternity dress that made her glow, her hand resting protectively on her 7-month belly. Daniel was stationed 3 hours away but promised to arrive by evening, driving straight from base to celebrate with his wife. Grace was happy. For the first time in years she was genuinely completely happy. She was laughing at a joke Amara's husband had made when Marcus walked through the gate, uninvited and unwanted, carrying his bottle of wine and his years of resentment like loaded weapons into her sanctuary. Time fractured after the wine hit Grace's face. She heard screaming, her own voice, Amara's, her mother's. She felt hands on her arms, people pulling her away from Marcus, who stood frozen now, the empty bottle dangling from his fingers as if he just realized what he'd done. "You destroyed my life," Marcus shouted, but his voice was desperate now, panicked. "Everything was fine until you." Emmanuel stepped forward, phone already recording. "Leave now, or I'm calling the police." "She's my wife," Marcus screamed. "No," Grace said quietly, wine dripping from her hair. "I was never truly your wife. I was your victim. But not anymore." That's when Daniel arrived. He'd left his base early, wanting to surprise Grace, to spend more time celebrating their child. He parked his truck and walked through the gate expecting music and laughter. Instead, he found his pregnant wife soaked in wine, shaking, surrounded by horrified guests and a man who radiated violence. Daniel was trained to assess threats instantly. He saw Marcus, saw the empty bottle, saw Grace's condition, and understood everything in seconds. He crossed the garden in 4 strides, his military bearing transforming him into something formidable and dangerous. "Who are you?" Daniel's voice was low, controlled, lethal. Marcus turned, and whatever courage or rage had carried him this far evaporated when he met Daniel's eyes. I'm her ex-husband. I just wanted to talk to her. You assaulted my pregnant wife, Daniel said, each word precise. At her baby shower. The reality of his actions hit Marcus then, visible on his face. The recognition that he'd crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, that this wasn't a dramatic gesture he could walk away from. This was assault. Criminal behavior. Something with consequences far beyond social embarrassment. It was just wine, Marcus stammered. I didn't touch her. You poured a bottle of wine on a pregnant woman, Emmanuel interrupted, still recording. I have everything on video. So do 3 other people here. Marcus looked around wildly. Every phone in the garden was pointed at him, documenting his crime, his complete breakdown. He'd imagined this moment differently. Grace crying, begging him to stop, everyone seeing that she still needed him. Instead, he saw only disgust and anger on every face. Grace, please, Marcus said, his voice breaking. Tell them it's not what it looks like. Grace stepped forward, Daniel's arm around her shoulders. She looked at the man who'd spent 3 years destroying her, the man who'd convinced her she was worthless, who'd come to her baby shower to humiliate her one final time. She felt no pity, no residual love, nothing but cold clarity. I'm pressing charges, she said. For assault. For harassment. For everything. Marcus's mother arrived then, having heard from a neighbor about her son's actions. She looked at Marcus, at Grace, at the devastated celebration, and her face crumpled. What have you done? She whispered. Marcus, what have you done? But Marcus couldn't answer. He was staring at Daniel, at the insignia on his uniform that marked him as a captain, at the strength and control in his bearing. Marcus understood then that he hadn't just assaulted any woman. He'd assaulted a military officer's wife. The consequences would be severe and permanent. The police arrived within minutes, called by multiple guests. They took statements. They saw the video evidence. They arrested Marcus on the spot for assault, noting Grace's pregnancy as an aggravating factor. His mother wept, begging Grace to reconsider, to show mercy, to think about their shared history. I thought about our shared history every day for 3 years, Grace said, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. Every day he told me I was worthless. Every night he came home smelling like another woman. Every moment he made me feel like I deserved his cruelty. That history is exactly why I'm pressing charges. Marcus was led away in handcuffs, still trying to justify himself, still claiming he'd been provoked, still blaming Grace for his choices. The guests slowly dispersed, the celebration ruined but the unity clear. Everyone stood with Grace, supported her, validated her decision to pursue justice. Daniel took Grace home, helped her shower, held her while she cried angry tears about the violation of her peace, her joy, her celebration of new life. But through her tears, Grace felt something else, freedom. Marcus had played his final card and lost. There was nothing left he could take from her, no way left to hurt her that mattered. She'd survived him, and now she'd watch him face real consequences for the first time in his life. The trial happened 3 months later, 2 weeks after Grace gave birth to a healthy baby girl she named Hope. The courtroom was packed. Grace's family, friends, former colleagues of Marcus who'd watched his pattern of abuse toward multiple women over the years. Even Vivian attended, ready to testify about Marcus's character if needed. Marcus's lawyer argued that it was just wine, that no physical harm had occurred, that Marcus had been emotional about seeing his ex-wife pregnant. But Emmanuel presented overwhelming evidence. The video footage showing Marcus's deliberate actions, medical documentation of Grace's distress that day, testimony from guests who'd witnessed Marcus's threatening behavior, messages Marcus had sent to mutual acquaintances expressing rage about Grace's new life. Most damning were Grace's own words. A clear, detailed account of their marriage, the abuse she'd endured, the pattern of behavior that culminated in the baby shower assault. She spoke calmly, without drama, simply stating facts that painted a picture of a man who'd systematically destroyed her mental health and then, when she escaped and rebuilt, had tried to destroy her again. I was 7 months pregnant, Grace testified. This wasn't about the wine. It was about power. He wanted to remind me that he could still hurt me whenever he chose. That even though I'd divorced him, even though I'd found happiness, he could still take that away. The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over countless domestic violence cases, listened intently. When she delivered her verdict, her voice was firm and unambiguous. Mr. Adenuga, you assaulted a pregnant woman at her baby shower out of spite and jealousy. Your actions endangered both mother and unborn child. Your history of emotional abuse toward the victim is well documented. This court finds you guilty of assault. Marcus was sentenced to 18 months in prison, 5 years of probation afterward, mandatory anger management counseling, and a permanent restraining order forbidding any contact with Grace or her family. Additionally, the judge ordered him to pay substantial damages. Money Marcus didn't have, debts that would follow him for years. His career collapsed immediately. The finance firm fired him after the arrest, citing moral character clauses in his contract. His reputation was destroyed, not through gossip but through his own documented actions captured on video and shared across social media. Everywhere Marcus went, people knew him as the man who'd assaulted his pregnant ex-wife at her baby shower. Marcus's mother stopped defending him after the verdict. His father, a retired teacher who'd always preached integrity, publicly disowned him. Even his younger brother Kenneth, who tried repeatedly to help, finally accepted that Marcus refused to change, refused to accept responsibility, refused to acknowledge that his suffering was entirely self-inflicted. Vivian divorced Marcus while he was in prison, remarrying a year later to a kind man who treated her with respect. She thrived, spoke openly about surviving her ordeal with Marcus, became an advocate for women escaping toxic relationships. She and Grace never became friends. The history was too complex, but they acknowledged each other with understanding when they passed at community events. Grace's life moved forward beautifully. Daniel was promoted to major, a recognition of his exemplary service and character. Their daughter Hope grew healthy and loved, surrounded by family who protected her fiercely. Grace returned to teaching, found deep joy in mentoring young women navigating difficult relationships, used her painful experience to help others recognize and escape abuse before it destroyed them. 2 years after the baby shower incident, Grace and Daniel welcomed a son they named Daniel Jr. The christening was peaceful and joyful, attended by everyone who mattered. No drama, no uninvited guests, no shadows from Grace's past. Just love, celebration, and the promise of a future built on respect and genuine partnership. Marcus was released from prison after serving 16 months with good behavior. He found work as a night security guard at a shopping complex, lived in a single room he could barely afford, and had no friends, no prospects, no one who trusted him. His attempts to reconnect with his family were met with silence. His mother had moved on, focusing her energy on Kenneth's children instead, grandchildren she could be proud of. He saw Grace once, 5 years after the baby shower. She was at a restaurant with Daniel, Hope and their son celebrating Hope's 5th birthday. The little girl wore a princess dress and a crown, laughing at something her father said. Grace looked radiant, confident, completely at peace. She didn't see Marcus standing outside the restaurant window, but even if she had, she wouldn't have cared. He was nothing to her now, not even a memory that hurt anymore. Marcus walked away from that window carrying the weight of his choices. Every door he'd slammed shut through his cruelty, every bridge he'd burned through his pride, every relationship he'd destroyed through his selfishness, all of it had led him here, to watching through glass at a life he could have had if he'd been capable of basic decency. The lesson was painfully simple. You cannot pour poison into someone's life for years and expect them to suffer forever. Grace had survived him, healed from him, and built something beautiful from the ruins of what he'd destroyed. Meanwhile, Marcus would carry his consequences until his last breath. Not because the world was unfair, but because actions have weight, cruelty leaves scars, and some bridges once burned can never be rebuilt. Grace never told her children about Marcus. He didn't deserve space in their story, but she taught them about resilience, boundaries, and the courage to walk away from people who diminish you. She taught them that strength isn't staying in situations that destroy you. Strength is having the wisdom to leave and the faith to rebuild. And when Hope asked one day why some people were cruel, Grace told her daughter the truth. Because they're broken inside and refuse to heal. But their brokenness doesn't have to break you. You can choose differently. You can choose to be kind, to be whole, to build rather than destroy. Marcus's name became a cautionary tale in their community. A reminder that character matters, that how you treat people in private defines who you truly are, that you cannot escape the consequences of deliberate cruelty. His life became small, bitter, and lonely, exactly as he'd made it through years of choices that prioritized his ego over everyone else's humanity. Grace's life became large, joyful, and full, exactly as she built it through courage, resilience, and the wisdom to recognize that she deserved better than the prison Marcus had tried to keep her in. The contrast between their futures wasn't coincidence or luck. It was consequence, the inevitable result of choices made, values held, and character revealed when tested. That was the truth Marcus would never accept. Grace didn't win by destroying him. She won by refusing to let him destroy her.